The first time I realized something was changing, it wasn't because my brother put on a dress. It was because he looked at his own reflection like it might finally answer a question he'd been carrying for years. I remember the sound of the rain that night, tapping against the kitchen window like it wanted to come inside, and the way the hallway light spilled softly under his bedroom door. We'd grown up sharing everything: cereal boxes, secrets, the quiet understanding that our house was never quite loud enough to drown out our thoughts. He was always the calmer one, the listener, the kid who stood just half a step behind the rest of the world. I used to think that was shyness. Now I know it was something heavier, something unnamed that he carried in his chest like a second heart. That night, I was passing his room when I heard a sharp intake of breath, the kind you make when you surprise yourself. I knocked without thinking, and when he opened the door, there was a flicker of panic in his eyes, like I'd caught him mid-confession. He was wearing one of Mom's old cardigans, gray, soft, sleeves a little too long, and his hands were trembling as if they didn't yet know where to rest. "I'm sorry," he said quickly before I could say anything. "I'll put it back." The apology struck me harder than the image. He wasn't ashamed exactly, he was afraid. Afraid that this thing, whatever it was, might finally be seen. I didn't know what to do with that fear, so I did the only thing I could. I told him he didn't have to explain. And for a moment, the world held still. He didn't talk about it the next day or the day after that. Life slid back into its ordinary grooves: school, work, the clatter of dishes, the low hum of the television in the evenings. But something subtle had shifted. I noticed the way he lingered in clothing stores when we went shopping, pretending to look at his phone while his eyes traced fabrics, colors, shapes that had never belonged to him before. I noticed how he started growing his hair out just because, how he smiled differently when it brushed his cheeks. It was slow, almost invisible, like watching the tide come in when you're distracted by conversation. You don't notice the water rising until your shoes are wet. One afternoon, I found him sitting on the floor of his room, surrounded by a mess of emotions disguised as fabric. A skirt folded too carefully to be accidental. A blouse tucked away like a secret letter. He looked up at me, bracing for impact, and in that moment I understood that this wasn't about clothes at all. It was about permission to exist, to explore, to breathe without constantly checking the room for exits. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said, voice barely louder than a whisper. "I just know I cannot do it anymore." There was a strange honesty in that sentence, one that felt older than both of us. He wasn't asking for approval. He was asking for safety. As weeks passed, the changes became more visible, more deliberate. He practiced makeup in the evenings, wiping it off before dinner like a ritual of almosts. He studied himself in mirrors with a focus that bordered on reverence, tilting his head, adjusting posture, learning expressions that felt truer than the ones he'd worn before. Sometimes he laughed at himself, a nervous sound, like he was testing whether joy was allowed. Other times, he cried quietly, the kind of crying that doesn't want witnesses, but desperately needs them. The world, of course, did not make it easy. Strangers stared. Old friends asked careless questions. Family gatherings became tightrope walks of pronouns and expectations. I watched him flinch at every misstep, every sideways glance, and still he kept going. That was the bravest part. Not the clothes, not the presentation, but the decision to keep walking forward even when the ground felt unstable. One night, as we sat on the porch watching the sun sink into the horizon, he turned to me and said, "I think I've been pretending to be someone else for so long that I forgot how to recognize myself." His voice wasn't sad. It was tired and hopeful, like someone who has finally admitted they're lost and believes for the first time that being lost might be the beginning of something. I realized then that I wasn't just watching my brother change. I was witnessing the slow, deliberate unfolding of a truth that had been waiting patiently for its moment. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that this was only the beginning. The first time my brother went outside dressed the way he felt inside, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. I remember standing behind him in the hallway, watching him lace his shoes with a care that felt ceremonial, like each loop and pull was anchoring him to a decision that could no longer be undone. He wore a simple outfit, nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed for attention, but it was unmistakably different from the version of him the world thought anew. Softer lines, gentler colors, a quiet confidence stitched together with fear. "Do I look ridiculous?" he asked, not turning around. The question wasn't really about appearance. It was about survival, about whether the world would let him exist without punishment. I told him the truth as best I could, that he looked like himself, or at least closer to it than I'd ever seen. He closed his eyes when I said that, just for a second, like he was letting the words settle somewhere deep enough to matter. Outside, the neighborhood was unchanged, same cracked sidewalks, same mailboxes leaning at tired angles, but everything felt sharper, louder. Every passing car sounded like a judgment. Every open window felt like an audience. I walked beside him, half a step behind this time, mirroring the way he'd spent years doing the same for everyone else. His posture was tentative at first, shoulders drawn in, arms unsure of where to rest. Then, gradually, something shifted. He straightened. His steps found a rhythm. He breathed. Not everyone was kind. A laugh floated from across the street, careless and sharp. Someone whispered something they thought we couldn't hear. Each moment landed on him like a small stone, not enough to knock him down, but enough to leave bruises you couldn't see. I watched his face carefully, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes flicked toward the ground and then, stubbornly, lifted again. He was learning, in real time, how to carry himself through a world that hadn't been built with him in mind. At home, the transformation continued in quieter ways. He began practicing his voice, not forcing it, not changing it completely, but exploring its range like a musician learning an unfamiliar instrument. He stood in front of mirrors and talked to himself, rehearsing conversations that might never happen, answers to questions no one had asked yet, but everyone seemed ready to. Sometimes he'd stop mid-sentence and laugh, embarrassed by his own courage. Sometimes he'd go very still, staring at his reflection like it might finally speak back. Our parents noticed, of course. How could they not? The tension crept into the house like fog, filling corners, softening edges, making everything feel uncertain. Questions were asked carefully at first, then less so. Is this a phase? Are you sure? What will people think? Each one carried concern, confusion, and fear tangled together so tightly it was hard to tell where one ended and the next began. My brother answered as honestly as he could, even when his voice shook. He didn't have all the words yet, but he had enough to say, "This is real to me." There were nights he sat on his bed surrounded by discarded versions of himself, fabric pooling at his feet like old skins. He talked about childhood memories that suddenly made sense, the envy he felt watching girls get ready for dances, the strange comfort he found in roles that let him be softer, the quiet disappointment of being praised for toughness he never wanted. Listening to him was like rereading a book and realizing the meaning had been there all along, just waiting for the right lens. One evening, he showed me a photo on his phone. It was him, posed awkwardly, smiling like he wasn't sure he was allowed to. "I don't hate this," he said. The words were small, but they carried the weight of a confession. Not hating himself was new, radical, revolutionary. The setbacks still came. A friend stopped returning messages. A stranger's comment lingered longer than it should have. There were days he retreated back into old clothes, old habits, like a turtle pulling into its shell after a scare. On those days, the light dimmed in his eyes, and I worried. Not that he'd give up, but that the effort of becoming himself might exhaust him completely. But then there were the other days. Days when he experimented with color and smiled at his own reflection without flinching. Days when someone used the right name, the right words, and he carried that moment with him like a talisman. Days when he talked about the future, not vaguely, not fearfully, but with plans. Those days felt like proof that the path he was on, however difficult, was leading somewhere real. I realized I was changing too. My understanding of him deepened into something quieter and stronger than simple support. I was learning to see the world through his eyes, to recognize how much courage it takes just to show up when who you are feels like a risk. Watching him, I understood that transformation isn't loud or instant. It's a series of choices made in private, repeated until they become visible. By the time autumn arrived, his reflection had softened in ways that went beyond clothes or hair or posture. There was a steadiness there, fragile but growing. He still doubted. He still feared. But beneath it all was a sense of direction he'd never had before. And as I stood beside him, watching leaves fall and seasons turn, I knew we were moving towards something neither of us could fully name yet, but something honest. The winter that followed felt like a test the world had designed specifically for him. The cold has a way of stripping things down, of forcing you to choose what you can carry and what you have to leave behind, and I watched my brother navigate it with a determination that surprised even him. Layers became both protection and expression, coats that draped differently, scarves chosen not just for warmth, but for how they framed his face. He moved through the season like someone learning to inhabit a new climate, cautious, but unwilling to retreat. There was a moment in early December when he cut his hair in a way that made his hands shake afterward. Not dramatically, not as a statement, but intentionally. When he came home, snow clinging to his boots, he stood in the doorway and waited for reactions like someone bracing for a wave. Our mother blinked twice, said his name, then corrected herself mid-sentence and tried again. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't smooth. But it was an attempt, and I saw his shoulders loosen a fraction, like a knot finally acknowledging it could be untied. School and work were harder. Systems are slower than individuals, and policies lag behind people's lives. He filled out forms that didn't have the right boxes. He answered emails that felt like negotiations for his own existence. Some days he came home exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix, eyes dull with the effort of explaining himself over and over. "I don't want to be a lesson," he said once, sitting at the kitchen table long after dinner had gone cold. "I just want to be a person." And yet, there were unexpected allies. A co-worker who complimented his handwriting without hesitation. A barista who remembered his name and said it like it had always belonged to him. A stranger on the bus who smiled, not the kind that asks questions, but the kind that offers space. These moments were small, almost forgettable on their own, but together they formed a quiet counterweight to the harder days. I saw him collect them mentally, storing them away like evidence that the world wasn't uniformly hostile. At home, the conversations deepened. He talked about identity not as a destination but as a process, something fluid and demanding and strangely forgiving. He admitted fears he hadn't said out loud before. The fear of being wrong, the fear of asking for too much, the fear that even after all this effort, he might still feel unfinished. I didn't have answers for him. All I could offer was presence, the promise that whatever shape his truth took, he wouldn't have to hold it alone. One night, during a power outage that plunged the house into darkness, we lit candles and sat in the living room, shadows flickering across the walls. In that soft, unsteady light, he told me about dreams he'd had as a child, dreams where he was always running towards something just out of reach, always waking up before he could see what it was. "Lately," he said, staring into the flame, "I think I know what I was chasing." His voice didn't waver. It didn't need to. The physical changes were subtle, but meaningful. The way he carried himself shifted again, less tentative now, more deliberate. He practiced patience with his own reflection, learning which days required kindness instead of critique. There were mornings he stood very still, breathing slowly, like he was syncing his internal rhythm with the person he saw in the mirror. Those moments felt sacred, even mundane as they were. Becoming yourself, I learned, is often quiet work. Not everyone adjusted. There were relatives who avoided eye contact, conversations that stayed stubbornly shallow. There were silences that spoke louder than words. I watched him absorb these things, deciding which ones deserved space in his heart and which ones didn't. It wasn't a clean process. He faltered. He second-guessed. But he didn't disappear. That, more than anything, felt like progress. As winter edged toward spring, something in him began to thaw. He laughed more easily. He argued less with himself. He started talking about goals that extended beyond survival, classes he might take, places he might go, versions of the future that included him fully, not as an afterthought. Hearing him speak that way made my chest ache in a good way. It felt like witnessing the first green shoots after a long freeze, fragile but undeniably alive. I realized then that the transformation wasn't just reshaping how the world saw my brother. It was reshaping how he saw time itself. The past was no longer a series of mistakes to apologize for. The future was no longer a threat to brace against. There was a present now, vivid and demanding, asking him to step into it honestly. And he was answering one day at a time. Spring arrived quietly, almost apologetically, as if it wasn't sure it was welcome yet, and in that hesitation, I saw so much of my brother that it nearly broke me. The light changed first. Mornings grew softer, stretching their fingers across his bedroom walls, and he began opening his curtains instead of hiding behind them. That alone felt monumental. For so long, daylight had been something to endure, not something to invite in. He started spending more time outside, not because he had somewhere specific to go, but because he wanted to be seen without it feeling like a confrontation. Walks became longer. Errands became less rushed. I noticed how he no longer rehearsed every movement before leaving the house, how his hands stopped clenching at his sides. There was still caution, still awareness, but it was layered now with something gentler, a willingness to exist without apology. One afternoon, he asked me to come with him to a small cafe across town. It wasn't special in any obvious way: mismatched chairs, handwritten menus, the smell of coffee clinging to everything, but it was unfamiliar territory, and that mattered. We sat by the window, sunlight catching on the rim of his cup, and I watched him interact with the world in real time. He ordered without hesitating. He thanked the server without shrinking. When someone glanced his way, he met their eyes and didn't look down. My throat tightened as I realized how much effort that simple exchange would have required just months earlier. "I'm tired," he said suddenly, stirring his drink even though the sugar had long dissolved. "But it's a different kind of tired." He struggled to explain it, searching for the right words. Not the exhaustion of hiding, but the fatigue that comes from growth, from stretching muscles you didn't know you had. It was honest tiredness. Earned tiredness. The kind that means something is actually happening. There were setbacks, of course. A comment overheard in passing that sent him spiraling for days. A form returned with corrections that felt like erasure. A family friend who smiled too tightly and spoke too loudly, as if volume could bridge discomfort. On those days, he retreated inward, questioning everything again. I learned not to rush him out of those moments. Doubt, I realized, wasn't a sign of failure, it was part of the terrain. One evening stands out more sharply than the rest. He came home late, eyes red, movements heavy, and sat down on the kitchen floor like his legs had simply given up. "What if this is as good as it gets?" he asked, not looking at me. The question hung between us, raw and terrifying. It wasn't about clothes or names or acceptance anymore. It was about whether becoming yourself guarantees peace, or just trades one kind of ache for another. I sat with him there, the cold tile seeping through our clothes, and for a long time neither of us spoke. Then he took a breath and said something that surprised us both. "Even if it is, I don't think I could go back." There was no drama in his voice, no defiance, just truth. And in that truth, I saw how far he'd come. The door behind him wasn't just closed, it no longer existed. Gradually, his world widened. He found online communities where he didn't have to explain the basics, where shared understanding acted like shorthand for belonging. He attended a small local meetup, came home buzzing with nervous energy, talking too fast, smiling too wide. "They didn't look at me like I was strange," he said. "They just looked." That mattered more than approval ever could. The changes in him were no longer just internal. His confidence reshaped how others responded. People mirrored what he projected, still imperfectly, still inconsistently, but enough to notice a shift. He learned how to correct gently, how to advocate for himself without hardening. Watching him navigate those interactions felt like witnessing someone learn a new language and then choose poetry instead of shouting. At home, our parents continued their own slow transformation. Mistakes happened. Emotions flared. But there were also unexpected moments of grace. A question asked with genuine curiosity, a compliment offered without qualification, a pause before speaking that signaled thoughtfulness instead of resistance. Healing didn't arrive in grand gestures. It arrived in small, cumulative acts that built trust brick by brick. Late one night, I found him sitting at his desk, writing in a notebook he'd started keeping. He let me read a page. It wasn't polished or performative, just fragments of thought, reflections on days that felt like milestones and days that felt like failures. On the last line, he'd written, "I am not late to my life. I am arriving." That sentence stayed with me. It reframed everything. All the years he'd spent feeling out of step, all the waiting, all the quiet endurance, it wasn't wasted time. It was preparation. Watching him now, more grounded than I'd ever seen him, I understood that transformation isn't about becoming someone new. It's about allowing the truth you've always carried to finally take up space. By the time summer began to hint at its return, my brother stood differently in the world. Not fearless, not untouched by doubt, but present. And presence, I learned, is its own kind of courage, one that doesn't announce itself, but changes everything once it's there. Summer didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in through open windows, through evenings that refused to end, through the way my brother started leaving the house, without checking the weather first. There was a lightness to him that season, not the absence of weight, but the balance of it, like he'd finally learned how to carry himself without constantly bracing for impact. I noticed it in the way he laughed, fuller now, less guarded, as if joy no longer felt like something he had to earn. He made a decision in June that terrified him more than almost anything else he'd done so far. He applied for a new job. Not a reinvention, not a dramatic declaration, just a step forward that required him to introduce himself as he truly was from the very first line of the application. I watched him agonize over every word, every detail, as if accuracy could guarantee safety. When he finally clicked submit, his hands shook, and he sat back like he'd just run a long distance. The waiting was brutal. Each email notification made his heart leap and sink all at once. He oscillated between hope and certainty of rejection, sometimes within the same sentence. "Maybe they'll see past everything else," he'd say, then immediately follow it with, "or maybe they won't see me at all." I didn't know which outcome he feared more. The interview, when it came, was unremarkable in all the ways that mattered. No dramatic confrontation. No grand validation. Just questions about skills, experience, availability. When he came home afterward, he looked stunned. "They just talked to me," he said, incredulous. Like it was normal. The word lingered between us, fragile and powerful. Normal wasn't boring. Normal was relief. He got the job. I don't think I'll ever forget the way he reacted to that news. Not jumping, not shouting, but sitting very still, eyes filling slowly, like his body needed time to understand that something good had happened without conditions attached. That moment marked a shift I hadn't anticipated. For the first time, his future wasn't hypothetical. It had structure. It had continuity. It had mornings that led somewhere. With that stability came new challenges. New coworkers meant new impressions, new risks, new calculations. There were days he came home drained, not from overt hostility, but from the quiet vigilance of being visible. "I don't want to be brave today," he admitted once, collapsing onto the couch. "I just want to be tired for ordinary reasons." That sentence broke my heart because it revealed how often bravery had been required just to exist. But there were good days too. Days when someone complimented his work without hesitation. Days when a casual conversation didn't veer into dangerous territory. Days when he forgot briefly to be afraid. Those days accumulated, slowly tipping the scale. Our relationship changed in ways I hadn't expected. We talked more honestly about everything, not just his journey, but mine too. Watching him claim space made me examine the places in my own life where I'd been shrinking without realizing it. His courage was contagious, not because it was loud, but because it was deliberate. He chose himself again and again, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was exhausting. One evening, we attended a small outdoor gathering, nothing formal, just friends of friends, string lights glowing like low-hanging stars. I watched him move through the crowd, greeting people, listening, responding, fully present. There was a moment when someone new was introduced to him, and they smiled, shook his hand, and used the right words without hesitation. He didn't react outwardly, but later on the drive home, he pressed his forehead to the window and whispered, "I didn't have to correct them." The relief in his voice was so profound it felt like a victory we both shared. Not everything resolved neatly. There were still relatives who kept their distance, still bureaucratic hurdles that reduced his life to paperwork. There were still mornings when he stared at his reflection too long, cataloging imperfections like they might add up to a verdict. But those moments no longer defined him. They were interruptions, not conclusions. One night in late summer, we sat outside together, cicadas humming, the air thick with heat and memory. He talked about the past, not with bitterness, but with a kind of gentle curiosity. "I used to think I lost so much time," he said. "Now I think I was just learning how to listen." He looked at me then, really looked and smiled. "Thank you for listening first." I realized then that this story wasn't just about transformation. It was about trust, about the fragile, extraordinary act of letting someone witness you becoming. I had watched my brother step into himself piece by piece, not as a performance, but as a practice. And in doing so, he taught me that authenticity isn't a single leap, it's 1,000 small steps taken even when no one is clapping. As summer began to fade, there was a quiet confidence in him that hadn't existed before. Not the kind that demands recognition, but the kind that endures. He wasn't finished. None of us ever are. But he was no longer waiting to begin. The year turned without ceremony, as years tend to do, and somewhere in that quiet transition, I realized I had stopped thinking of my brother's life in terms of before and after. There was just now. Just him. The person who stood in the kitchen in the mornings, humming absent-mindedly while the kettle heated. The person who complained about traffic, forgot where he put his keys, laughed at jokes that weren't very funny. Ordinary details, layered together, forming something extraordinary simply because they were real. He still faced moments of doubt. I don't think those ever disappear completely, but they no longer ruled him. I saw it in how he handled missteps, with patience instead of panic. In how he corrected people calmly, without the tremor that used to give him away. In how he forgave himself for bad days instead of using them as evidence against his worth. Self-acceptance didn't arrive as a revelation, it arrived as a habit. One afternoon, months later, we found ourselves looking through old photo albums. Images of childhood birthdays, awkward haircuts, forced smiles. He studied them quietly, tracing the edges of memories with his finger. I expected sadness, maybe grief. Instead, he smiled, soft, understanding. "I wasn't lying back then," he said. "I just didn't have the language yet." That sentence felt like a closing door, not slammed shut, but gently, respectfully closed. The world, too, had adjusted in its imperfect way. Some people never did. Others surprised us. Life continued to offer both kindness and cruelty, sometimes in the same breath. But my brother met it now with a steadiness I admired deeply. He no longer seemed to be asking for permission to exist. He simply did. The most profound change wasn't in how he dressed, or spoke, or moved, though all of that mattered. It was in how he occupied silence. There was no longer a constant undercurrent of apology in his presence. No tension that begged to be resolved. Just a quiet assurance that he belonged in his own skin, even on days when that skin felt unfamiliar. One evening, as we walked together under a sky washed clean by rain, he said something so casually, I almost missed it. "I'm happy," he said. Not ecstatic. Not triumphant. Just happy. The words settled into the air between us, simple and complete. I thought back to that first night, the rain on the window, the trembling hands, the apology that had broken my heart. I wished I could reach back through time and tell him how this story would unfold. But maybe not knowing was part of what made it possible. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that becoming yourself is rarely a straight line and never a spectacle. It's a series of quiet choices, made again and again, often in the dark, often without witnesses. My brother didn't transform overnight. He emerged slowly, patiently, like something that had always been alive beneath the surface, waiting for the right conditions to breathe. And when I look at him now, I don't see someone who changed into a woman, or someone who left a former self behind. I see someone who finally stopped running from their reflection and learned how to stand still long enough to recognize it. That, to me, is the most powerful transformation of all.